Web server security. Even though IIS 6 on Windows Server 2003 provides the best security ever in a default installation of IIS, there's still many things to consider before deploying your site out for the world to see. Firstly, we're going to take a look at the web service extensions, find out a little bit more about what they are, what they do, and how we can secure them. Next, we'll discuss the multi-purpose Internet Mail Exchange types, or MIME types, and talk about how they're applied at the web server and website level. Then we'll move on and talk about permissions. That's right, good old NTFS permissions, and find out how we can use NTFS permissions to further enhance the security of our web server. In addition to NTFS permissions, IIS has its own set of permissions to assist you in locking down your server. Now, one of the first lines of defense you'll have with your web server is IP address restrictions, and we'll learn about how you can prevent or allow users to access your content depending on what IP address or IP subnet or domain they happen to be calling from. And finally, we'll look at securing your log files and the actual content on your web server. Okay, well, we'll start with web service extensions. So what is a web service extension? Well, it's simply a request handler that allows you to run dynamic content such as scripts. Now, by default, IIS is configured in a more secure lockdown mode. In fact, if you want to run any web service extension such as an ASP.NET page or PHP or a Perl script, you'll need to manually turn these things on. So let's open up our IIS MMC by clicking on Start, Administrative Tools, and then launching Internet Information Services Manager. Now, if we expand our server, you'll see that we have an option here for web service extensions. Now, if we select this, over here on the right hand side, we can see all of the web service extensions that we have defined on our server, as well as whether they're enabled or allowed to run, or if they're prohibited from running. Now, most of these web service extensions are prohibited by default, so there's not a lot here that you need to do, if anything. Now, if you are planning on using a different scripting language such as PHP or Perl, you're likely to need to configure your own web service extensions. And if you're interested in how to do that, be sure to check out our video on installing PHP and Perl, where we show you how to install these scripting languages and then configure IIS so that these sort of scripts are allowed to run on your server. Now, the simple rule of thumb here is if you don't require a particular web service extension to be active, then make sure it's listed as prohibited and it will prevent it from running on your server, thus reducing the attack surface of your server. Now, if you must be able to run these scripts, then enable only what you need. So to enable or prohibit a web service extension from running, it's a simple process. Simply select the web service extension and either click on Allow if you want the web service extension to be authorized to run, or Prohibit if you want to stop the web service from running. Now, if you want to lock down all web service extensions quickly and without exception, you can select the hyperlink down here to prohibit all web service extensions, and this might be useful if you're experiencing problems or just want to be able to stop any sorts of script from running. Okay, well, let's move on and take a look at MIME types. MIME types specify how mail programs or web browsers handle data received from the server. IIS specifies the MIME type associated with the data that it sends to the client and which client applications will be able to process or display the data. Now, you don't have to get in and configure all of these, as IIS is pre-configured with a common set of globally registered MIME types which are recognized by all websites. However, you can define your own MIME types or change or remove other MIME types that you don't need. Now, when you define your own MIME types, you can do this at the web server, website, or even down to the directory level. If you define a MIME type at the web server level, then that MIME type will be applied to the entire IIS server, whereas a MIME type applied to the website or directory level will only apply to a folder within a website or files within a folder. Now, in our IIS MMC, we'll take a look at MIME types on a global level, but the process is identical for configuring these at the individual website level or the directory level. Now the reason I choose the global level to have a look at is that the default website and directories don't have any MIME types defined. So to see a list of pre-configured MIME types on our IIS server, we'll need to go and take a look at these at the global level. So we'll right click on our server, server 01, and select properties. Now at the bottom here we can see MIME types. Now by the way, I'll just quickly cancel this. When you configure MIME types at the website or the directory level, if we expand websites here and we'll right click on our default website and select properties, you'll find MIME types on the HTTP headers directory down the bottom here. And this is the same for directories too. You just simply right click on a directory, select properties, and then the HTTP headers tab. Okay, back to our global properties. We'll come down here at the bottom and we'll select the MIME types button. Now in this window you can see all of the file types or file extensions that IIS is pre-configured to know about, and I'd wager that 90% of these or more you probably won't use. Okay, it's important to understand that in order for IIS to be able to serve files, the MIME type needs to be registered or IIS won't use it. So if you have a custom application that you've coded with a funky new file extension and you need IIS to be able to serve this file out to users on the internet, then you'll need to create a new MIME type. So to create a new MIME type, we'll simply come up here and click on the New button, and you'll need to enter in two things. The first is the file extension, which hypothetically, let's say it's a WTR file. And in the MIME type field, you'll need to enter in a description that exactly matches the file type defined on the client computer. Now once you've confirmed everything is right, you'd simply click on OK, and now IIS can start serving WTR files. Now, it's best practice to remove any MIME types that you won't be using. That way, IIS won't serve the unwanted file types. So for example, let's say under no circumstances do you ever want IIS to know about or serve zip files. Then we'll simply scroll all the way down to the bottom here. We'll click on .zip and then we'll click the remove button. Are we sure we want to do this? Yes, we are. And then we'll simply click on OK. It's that simple, and zip files no longer are supported on our IIS server. Now I know it might seem like a bit of a pain, but removing all of these unwanted MIME types from your IIS server certainly locks it down much more securely, as now only authorized file types can be served. Okay, well let's move on and take a look at the next thing that we can do to further secure IIS, and that's permissions. Now when we talk about permissions, most people instantly think about NTFS permissions, and good, they're certainly there and they can be used to grant or deny access to your files and folders on your hard drive. But IIS has its own set of permissions as well. Now IIS permissions can be applied at the website, virtual directory and file level, and they're applied and take effect before NTFS permissions. So let's take a look at permissions of a website. So we'll right click on our default website and we'll choose properties. Now on the home directory tab, we can see a list of various permissions here. The first permission is read, and that's enabled by default, and this gives users permission to view files and directory content. In almost all cases you're going to leave read as the permission for a file or directory. Next we have write, which allows users to modify files and directory content. Now generally speaking, most times you're unlikely to add the right permission to a file or directory, unless perhaps you're using WebDAV or have pre-authenticated specific users that need write access. If you do need to grant write access, consider granting it at the lowest possible level, such as for a specific file or folder only. But for general viewing websites, you'd leave this unchecked to deny the ability for users to be able to write to your directories. Now we also have script source access, which allows users to access source code for scripts. Now like the write permission, unless you have specific users or you're using WebDAV and you require access to source code, I'd leave this one unchecked. Then we have directory browsing, which allows users to view file listings, similar to a crude Windows Explorer style listing. Now in most cases, you won't want to have this enabled unless perhaps there's a list of files that you want users to be able to download over HTTP. Now next we have log visits, which is enabled by default, and this records a log entry for each visit to the content. So leave this checked so you have a record of who's accessing the content on your server. And finally here we have index this resource. Now this permission will be enabled by default if the indexing service is installed, and it allows the indexing service to index the content of the site to make searching faster. Now the next thing we have are the website executables permissions. Now down here under execute permissions we have a drop down box with 3 options. The first option is none, and this prevents users from running any scripts or programs. Now generally this setting will be set to none unless you need to run scripts. If you do need to run scripts from a particular directory, then set that directory to scripts only, which will then enable scripts to run. The other option we have here is scripts and executables, and this allows scripts and Windows binary executables, in other words .exe files, to be able to run on your server. Now if you are going to use scripts only or scripts and executables, then it's recommended that you place all of your scripts and executables in the same directory. That way you only need this permission to apply to one place and then set this to none for every other directory. So think about the content that's inside the directory before applying scripts or executable permissions. For example, if you have a directory which only contains images, then there's no point to allowing anything but read permission and then set the executable down here to none. Now when it comes to NTFS permissions, it's important to first take a look at where the content is stored. Now in this case, we can see that the home directory is located on our C drive in the inetpub www root directory. So what we'll do is we'll go and open up My Computer, we'll browse to our C drive, our inetpub directory, and then we'll right click on our www root directory and we'll select Properties and then the Security tab. Now here we can specify which users, whether they be anonymous users or otherwise, have permissions to view or modify files in this directory and possibly its subdirectories. Now when thinking about permissions, remember I mentioned that IIS permissions that we looked at a moment ago are applied before these NTFS permissions here. Now when these permissions are applied and there is a conflict, the most restrictive permission will apply. Now we can also secure IIS by using IP address restrictions. So if we click up here on our Directory Security tab and then under our IP address and domain name restrictions, we'll click on the Edit button. Now here we can selectively grant or deny access to users based on where they're coming from. In fact, this section here is the first line of defense as far as IIS is concerned. If a user attempts to access your website and they're listed as denied in this window, then they won't even go as far as testing the IIS or the NTFS permissions. Okay, so how does this work? Well, it's pretty easy. This window tells us that by default, that all computers that are listed here in this window will either be granted access or denied access depending on which radio button you've chosen. Now if you're running a relatively public web server, chances are that you'll leave this as granted access and maybe just selectively add computers that you do not want to be able to log on. Or possibly you won't even add any to the deny list at all. So any computers that we decide to add into this box will be denied access. Now conversely, and possibly more likely, if you have a website that you want to be highly restricted, then you'd probably set it the opposite way and choose to deny access to everyone and then selectively add in computers that you'd like to be able to access your server. So to add a computer or group of computers to the list, we'll simply come over here and choose the Add button. Now we can choose from a single computer, a group of computers, or a domain name which will cover every computer in an entire domain. So if we choose single computer, we can simply type in the IP address of the computer and then hit DNS lookup if we like, and if DNS is working properly, it will resolve the fully qualified domain name for us. So I'm going to enter in 192.168.0.11, which is the IP address of this server, and click on DNS lookup, and it resolves to server01.testdomain.com, which is the name of this server, and I'll click on OK, and then OK again. And now we can see that this computer has been granted access and everything else is now denied. So I'll choose the edit button again and we'll take another look at this. And if I now choose group this time, we can enter in a subnet and a subnet mask, and every computer that comes from this subnet would then be allowed access. And finally, we can also choose a domain. Now, if we select this, we do get a message telling us that our performance might suffer because for every single IIS connection, it needs to do a reverse lookup to be able to match the domain name. So unless you have a real good reason to enable this one, I'd try and restrict my choices to a single computer and groups based on IP address. Okay, well, another thing that's important for us to secure are log files. Why? Because they're a valuable source of information about your site, and we don't want them to be modified or even deleted, whether by accident or by a malicious user. So if we open up My Computer, we'll navigate to our C drive, our Windows directory, we'll scroll down and select our System32 directory, and you'll find your log files by default inside a directory called, funnily enough, log files. So if we right click on log files and select properties, followed by the security tab, make sure that you only add in users that need access to this directory. So remove any users or groups that don't require access, or at the very least, give them only read permissions. Okay, the final thing I need to make mention of regarding IIS security is your content. That's right, we've talked about everything else up until this point except your actual content. Now, one of the first recommendations that I have to give you is to store your websites on a partition that is separate from your system drive. In other words, if Windows is installed on the C drive, then install your websites on the D drive. And this is for two very good reasons. Firstly, technically speaking, having the content on a separate drive will make it perform better. Secondly, if a malicious user gains access to your content and it's on the same drive as your Windows installation, then they may have access to things like the command prompt, using what's called a directory traversal attack, and that can make it a real bad day for you, giving them the ability to run practically anything they want on your server. So stick your content on a separate drive for security's sake. Now, when you move your content to a different drive, don't forget to point IIS to the new directory. So we'll come down here to our IIS MMC, simply right click on your directory, select properties, and then select the home directory tab, and then change the local path to point to the new drive and folder path, and then configure the appropriate NTFS permissions. Okay, in this video we've talked about basic IIS security. We've discussed web service extensions and why you should enable only those that you need. We also talked about IIS and NTFS permissions. Remember, IIS permissions are applied first. So if you have disabled read permission, for example, at the root of your website, no one will be able to get in, even if the NTFS permissions allow access. So be sure to use both sets of permissions in conjunction with each other to provide users the minimum permissions they need to be able to use the site. Now, we also talked about IP address restrictions to grant or deny access based on IP address, subnet, or domain name. And we finished with a discussion about log files and securing your actual web content. Security is an important aspect in just about any computer nowadays. And if you're administering or designing public-facing computers like web servers, you need to be especially vigilant in ensuring that you're presenting a server that is as secure as possible.